that was something and we'll get into that, right? Our putting blanket statements on everybody during the pandemic and the impact that has. I want to ask now, the book is called The Big Fail. And I think that's an interesting one because obviously it insinuates that we failed. And by we, I guess I mean humanity. I'm not, and I know you talk about America specifically.
I do. We really don't get into international because there's only two of us and we only had
Right.
a couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us, what do you think, why was it such a failure? I know there's many reasons, but what is the biggest reason in your mind that we can say, look, we didn't do well?
Well, the biggest reason really has nothing to do with how we dealt with the pandemic in the here and now. The biggest reason has to do with trends that had taken place in American capitalism over the previous 30 or 40 years that we don't even think about anymore, that wound up having disastrous effects on hospitals, nursing homes, and shortages of supplies like nitrile gloves and masks.
Right.
And so let me drill down a little on this.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so where in percentage terms, more people died in nursing homes than any place else. And the Times stopped doing this, but the New York Times for a long time was calculating the percentage of deaths per state that took place in nursing homes. And some of them were astounding. There was like New Hampshire's like 65%. I mean, astounding numbers.
Wow.
And even in the low, it'd be like as low as 30 or 25%. It'd be as high as 70%. It was just amazing numbers. And why did this happen? The main answer is because nursing homes had been stripped to the bone by private equity firms and other entrepreneurs. And they had debt that they really couldn't afford. So, they have to lay off nurses and staff and patients and residents don't get quality of care, and et cetera, et cetera. And this is completely preventable. And the reason we know this is because in San Francisco, the largest nursing home in the country, 700 some odd residents, is run by the city, not by a private equity firm. And they had plenty of staff, and they did it right, and they sheltered their people in place. And as of March 2023, 10 people had died in that nursing home.
Wow.
So it tells you that if you do it right, if you could do it right, you can save lives. But we had this situation, this setup where nursing homes were like, they were out of a Dickens novel. So that's one example. The second example is, globalization, which nobody really gave much thought to. But globalization became this nirvana for companies that caused them to shut factories, lay off workers, move everything to China, set up just-in-time supply chains. But they never thought about what happens if there's an emergency. What happens if there's a crisis? So now we're hit with a crisis. The Chinese may have contracts to send masks to America, but they're not going to do that in a crisis. They're going to keep it for themselves.
Right.
So all of a sudden, every hospital is scrambling for masks, scrambling for nitrile gloves. Mm-hmm. They don't have there's no resilience in the system. So that's a second way a big way. And then a third way is the way the hospital system has evolved, where the big fancy hospital chains, they do fine, but they don't have the population that's really sick with COVID. And those people go to these hospitals that are,
Right.
Kind of a mess. That they do their best they can, but they don't have the facilities, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the machinery, they don't have the money.
Hmm.
They're dependent on Medicaid, which doesn't pay anywhere near enough. So, you have some hospitals that are just completely overloaded and people are dying left and right. And you have other hospitals that, I'm not saying they're empty, but they're not overflowing with COVID patients.
Yeah. Those are three great examples. And I'm glad you brought those up. I want to dig into some because, anybody who listens with regularity knows that I have left leaning, but I'm definitely not a zealot or anything like that. And oftentimes, let's take the nursing home example. I get stuck in the middle because, if it's not for capitalism, we don't get some of the innovation. I live near Washington, D.C. The government is highly wasteful and inefficient. So, privatizing something versus making it public, I don't know. But in this instance, it worked. What made the difference there in the San Francisco one? Or why were they
Well,
able to? I mean, were they
yeah,
efficient?
no, it had nothing to do with. Well, I'm sure they were. They paid their staff enough so they
Hmm.
didn't have a huge turnover. You
Okay.
know, they they were able to lock people down. They were able to take care of the patients.
Wow.
So the staff could be tested to see if they had COVID. They don't have COVID. They come in. They test. They test all the patients. They're not. One thing that happened as people would die in the other nursing homes, they would need to fill the bed to make money.
Oh,
And
right.
so somebody else would come in, new, they'd get sick or they'd spread it or whatever.
Hmm.
And so in San Francisco, that didn't happen. It had a very stable population as well. So
Yeah.
you're right about the government being inefficient. And the way I think about it is that in the case of nursing homes and hospitals, if you're going to have a private system, a capitalist system, you got to set the right rules.
Right.
You got to have rules about the number of staff. You got to have rules about what percentage of the revenue can be debt. I mean, what really offends me is the way private equity firms raped and pillaged nursing homes
Yeah.
for their own benefit, put it in their pocket, and then they walk away.
Yeah.
And did they step up during the pandemic? A few of them did, but
Hmm.
most of them didn't.
Right.
And honestly, I came to the view by the end of the book that that private equity should not be allowed into the healthcare system. They have no purpose. Hospital. Most industries profitability and is doesn't clash with the purpose of the company,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
With hospitals and nursing homes and healthcare in general, it definitely clashes. If a hospital wants to have a more profitable quarter, they got to do more surgeries because that's the way the
Right.
system works. Maybe those surgeries are necessary. Maybe they're not.
Hmm.
Or you got to have a monopoly in one area so you can hold up the insurance companies to force them to pay more than they should.
Yeah.
Or in the case of private equity, you sell the land. I mean, the first thing they often do is they sell the land to a REIT, a real
Hmm.
estate investment trust, and then pull that money out as profit. And now the private equity firm has to pay, now the nursing home has to pay rent on land that they used to own,
Wow.
right? And then in
Yeah.
addition, don't forget, the way private equity works is they buy something. This is any kind of company, and they mostly use debt because that's how they make money.
Right.
And they put the debt on the balance sheet of the company that they bought. So the nursing home company now has to not only pay rent, but they have to pay back the debt that the private equity firm used to buy it in the first place.
Well, that's crazy.
That's how it works. That's how
I,
it works.
I think about, just to pause here for those listening, if you're on your walk or whatever, right? You are a company, somebody started you, whatever, you own the land you're on, you've inevitably made money off the land because that's been the case for decades. If you look at a long enough time period, somebody buys you out and then they turn around, they take that profit from the land purchase, they saddle the company itself with the debt, and then you have to repay that along with the bills and investors and the
Right,
operating
and then of course every year the REIT raises the rent, so you have to pay more.
That's crazy.
But it's a terrible. I mean, it's just to me it's unconscionable. And
It is. Well, and when I was reading your book and I'm going through and you talk about the healthcare system, because it's not just nursing homes, but hospitals, as you mentioned. I just had a virtual appointment with the doctor, and she said, "Why didn't you go to your primary care physician for this?" And I said, "Because I called him. They said it would take 3 weeks, which is absurd."
Right.
And she goes, 3 weeks is nothing. I hear from people that can't get in for 3 months.
Yeah.
And she explained to me, due to the pandemic, and this is why I'm telling this story, I'd love your perspective on it, that highly due to the pandemic, they also knew there was going to be a physician shortage prior to the pandemic. It's at a breaking point.
Right. The nursing shortage is even worse, actually.
Is it?
Nurses, one thing that happened in the pandemic is that nurses just got ground down. They just, and this is the thing that's killed them. You're in a pandemic, right? So suddenly you can't do those extra surgeries, right? You can't make that extra money.
Right.
So what's their response? They start laying off nurses in the middle of a pandemic.
Wow.
That happened all over the country, and it's just, it's another one of those things. They care about their bottom line, and patient care is secondary. They will never admit that, but it's true. And so, again, this gets to the big picture of why we failed, was because we had a healthcare system that was not set up to succeed in an emergency.
So if you look at that, do you see do you see not just an end in sight, but this is going to happen again in some context? Will we take any of these lessons forward?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that in the case of globalization, things are actually changing, because it turns out in the end it wasn't just PPE and nitrile gloves that was short, but eventually we had a shortage of semiconductors. We had all kinds of shortages. I mean, really serious shortages of what's the drug? Adderall. We can't get any Adderall. There's a huge Adderall shortage in America. There's just all kinds of things like that. And what you are seeing is a lot of talk, at least, about pulling back a little bit on globalization so that we make more things at home. That's certainly something the Biden administration is pushing for. But the flip side of that, it means that things will cost a little more. Now, countries like Germany's a really good example. They accept that price, and in return, their workers have a lot more say than our workers do in how companies are run. They usually have the head of the union. Their unions are on the board of the companies and so on. So they have a different. They have a different system. Would the hospital system change? No, but the nursing home system might change. Here's the other thing, though: the next pandemic might not hit the elderly; it might hit children.
Right. Exactly.
You just don't know.
Yep.
And in this pandemic, it took a while for people to figure out that children were relatively safe.
Yep.
From the pandemic. Even when they got it, most of the time it was asymptomatic.
Yep.
So, the influenza pandemic of the 1918, it killed kids, it killed middle class people, it killed elderly people, middle aged people, elderly people. It was indiscriminate. This pandemic was a lot more discriminating. The older you got, the more likely you were to go to the hospital or to die. The younger you were, the less likely, which gets into all these issues about how the public health establishment explained all this to the public, and the ramifications of that.
Yeah.